In January of 1990, 39-year-old Marlene Warren made her way across her sprawling backyard in Wellington, Florida. Marlene and her husband Michael were hosting a barbecue for some of their friends and family and coworkers. And so far, the Florida winter weather had not disappointed. It was sunny and about 75 degrees Fahrenheit, so a perfect day for an outdoor party. Marlene looked down and checked the food on the grill. It smelled delicious and was almost ready to be served. Then she looked up and saw all the people in her yard who were talking and laughing and having a great time, and she smiled. Her backyard, and really her entire house, were made for big parties like this one. Where Marlene lived, Wellington, Florida, was a small upscale village not far from West Palm Beach that was filled with mansions and golf courses. Marlene and Michael's 5-bedroom home was over 5,000 square feet, it had a pool, and it even had an attached airplane hangar for Michael's prop plane. Marlene enjoyed the luxury that her house and her neighborhood provided, but really what she loved the most was all the space she had on her property so she could throw these big parties for all the people she loved. The smell of the food drifted across the backyard, and after a while, a few guests began heading towards the grill. And amongst those guests were a young couple, Sheila and Richard Keene, who walked up and asked Marlene if she needed any help. But Marlene said she had everything under control, and really she was just happy that Sheila and Richard had made it to the party. Sheila and Richard both worked for Marlene's husband, Michael, at the used car dealership that he owned, and so Marlene was just happy to meet some of these people that spent so much time with her husband. Sheila and Richard chatted for a little bit longer, and then they turned and headed back towards the party, at which point Marlene began taking the food off the grill and putting them out on serving dishes. As soon as Marlene's 21-year-old son, Joey, and a few of his friends saw Marlene putting the food out, they rushed over and grabbed some paper plates and began piling them full of food. Joey's father, Marlene's husband, Michael, spotted the boys doing what they were doing, and he laughed and told them to please save some food for the other guests. Then Michael walked over to the grill and put his arm around Marlene, and she leaned her head on his shoulder. Both of them had been so busy with work lately that it felt like they barely got any time together. So it was nice now to have a moment to relax together and just to enjoy the company of their friends and family. Marlene and Michael had been together for almost 18 years, and even though things weren't always perfect, Marlene couldn't imagine her life without her husband. Back in the mid-1960s, Marlene had gotten married to a different man. She gave birth to her first son at the age of 16, and she had Joey a few years later when she was 19. But not long after that, her first husband had died, and Marlene felt completely lost. She was now a widow at just 20 years old, and she was trying to raise 2 young boys all on her own. At the time, she had gotten a lot of support from her parents, but there were still moments when she just felt like surviving was almost impossible. Then she had met Michael, and it was like everything in her life got better. Michael was kind, he was handsome, he was driven to succeed, and he almost immediately became this loving father figure to Marlene's 2 boys. And Michael was just as taken with Marlene as she was with him. He thought she was absolutely stunning with her beautiful red hair and blue eyes, but more importantly, he thought of Marlene as being a really strong person who had managed to overcome this terrible tragedy, losing her first husband at such a young age. And so clearly Marlene was just this really mature person. And also, Michael really liked how driven Marlene was to succeed, just like he was. Marlene and Michael had gotten married in 1972, and they eventually moved to Florida. They started a real estate business that Marlene ran, and over the years, they'd come to own multiple rental properties. Michael had also opened up a used car dealership that specialized in selling and renting cars to people who struggled to get loans because of their credit. And ultimately, both the real estate and car business had taken off in ways that not even Marlene and Michael had seen coming. And so they ended up making millions and millions of dollars between them and then buying their beautiful home here in Wellington. In the backyard, Marlene and Michael stepped away from the grill and mingled with their guests. Marlene said she was glad people from different aspects of their life, friends, family, and work, all seemed to be getting along so well. Then Marlene and Michael split up to cover more ground and to see if any of their guests needed anything. A little while later, Marlene went back to the grill to cook more food, and her mother-in-law approached her. Marlene had a great relationship with Michael's mom, and they always had plenty to talk about, but her mother-in-law had a serious look on her face, so Marlene asked if everything was okay. Her mother-in-law leaned in, like she was about to tell Marlene some big secret. Then she just pointed toward some of Michael's employees, Sheila and Richard Keene, the 2 that Marlene had spoken to at the grill earlier, and in a quiet voice, she told Marlene to watch out for Sheila because she was young and pretty. Marlene understood that her mother-in-law was just trying to help. They both knew Michael could be a bit of a flirt, but Marlene wasn't too worried about anything like that. And so she ended up not really saying anything back to her mother-in-law after she made this comment. But inside, if she was going to worry about either of the Keens, it would not be Sheila, it would be Richard. Richard had a bit of a shady past. He'd faced weapons possession and drug charges with the police, and he worked for Michael as a repo man, which meant he took cars back from people when they were behind on payments. It was a difficult job, and a lot of people did not want to give up their cars, but Richard was known as a tough guy who people did not want to mess with, and so no matter how much people fought him, he would get them to give up their cars. Still, Marlene was not about to hold anybody's past against them. She knew Richard was one of Michael's hardest-working employees, and the two men, Michael and Richard, really seemed to get along well, so if Marlene's husband trusted him, then she did too. The party lasted into the night, and by the time the final guests left, Marlene felt exhausted but really happy. The barbecue had clearly been a success. Inside the house, she and Michael sat down on the couch and put their feet up. Michael looked over at his wife and said, "Hey, pretty soon we're going to have to start thinking about our next party, your 40th birthday." Marlene laughed because her 40th birthday was still almost 5 months away, but Michael said it was never too early to start thinking about it. After all, turning 40 was kind of a big deal. Marlene and Michael sat and talked a bit longer. Then Michael said he was tired and kissed his wife and headed to bed. Marlene stayed in the living room by herself, and as she sat there, it really hit her that she was going to turn 40 soon. Now, there was a time when she would have seen that as getting old, and she would have dreaded the birthday, but Marlene actually felt kind of excited for her birthday. For her age, she had actually accomplished a ton. She had the kind of life that people envied, and she believed that everything would just keep on getting better as she got older. About 6 months later, at around 11 a.m. on Saturday, May 26, 1990, Marlene was cooking food again. This time, though, she was in the kitchen making breakfast for her son Joey and two of his friends who were over at the house. Marlene finished up the food and then hollered for the boys to come and get it. Joey and his two friends rushed into the kitchen, they got their breakfast, and then went back into the living room to keep watching TV. Marlene was happy to have a relaxing weekend ahead of her. A little bit earlier, Michael had headed out to a racetrack in Miami with a friend about 70 miles away, so Marlene was totally solo, and she figured she might just spend the day driving around. Michael had surprised her for her 40th birthday with her dream car, a candy apple red Firebird. Marlene loved this sports car, and today felt like the perfect day to go out for a drive. But before she could head outside to hop in her car, the doorbell rang. Marlene was pretty sure her son and his friends were not going to get up to answer the door, so she headed to the front door and she opened it up. And as soon as she did, Marlene smiled, because standing there was a clown. It was this person in a clown costume with a curly red wig and white makeup, and this clown was holding balloons and a small picnic basket filled with flowers in one of their hands. At this point, Joey and his friends looked up from the couch towards the door, and when they saw the clown, they just started laughing. They wondered why there was a clown at the house, but they quickly turned back to the TV. As for Marlene, she figured these balloons and flowers must be some sort of late birthday present, or just a kind of random nice surprise from Michael. The clown grinned and handed the balloons and flowers to Marlene. Marlene said, "Oh, these are so pretty," and then began looking for a card to see who had sent this to her. But as she did this, Marlene didn't notice the clown pulled their other hand out from behind their back. And then a second later, in the living room, Marlene's son Joey suddenly heard a loud pop, and then he turned and looked towards the front door, and he saw the clown had turned and begun running away from the house, and his mother was now lying on the floor. Joey and his friends had no idea what just happened, but they ran over to Marlene's side, and right away they saw her face was covered in blood. She had been shot. The boys ran out the door screaming for this clown and screaming for help, and then at the end of the road, they saw a white Chrysler sedan called a LeBaron racing away around the corner. And so one of Joey's friends rushed back inside to call 911. Joey ran straight for his car, he hopped inside and began flying down the road after this Chrysler. But Joey, after turning the corner and driving all around the neighborhood, he could not find the white Chrysler LeBaron. It was gone. Not long after the 911 call, Detective Michael Harrison of the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Department arrived outside of Marlene's house. When Harrison had first gotten the call to investigate a shooting carried out by a clown in one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in the county, He wondered if he was hearing everything right, or if maybe a fellow officer was playing some sort of twisted joke on him. But Harrison quickly realized this was not a joke. After being shot, Marlene had been rushed to the hospital, and she was now fighting for her life. All Harrison knew about the person who had shot her was that they were last seen wearing a clown costume. Harrison walked towards Marlene's property. Officers who had arrived first on the scene had already cordoned off the yard with police tape, and out front they had gathered Joey, his two friends, and a neighbor who had heard the shooting while he was out walking his dog. Joey and his friends stood there with police, still in total shock. Joey's hands trembled, and the first thing he told Detective Harrison was that he'd gone after the shooter, but he had failed to catch them. Harrison did his best to calm Joey down. He knew this young man really just wanted to go to the hospital to see his mom, and Harrison also knew that the chaos of what had just happened would just make it really difficult for Joey to focus. But Joey and his friends were Harrison's best witnesses, and so he hoped he could get at least some information out of them right now. So Harrison asked Joey if there was anything he remembered about the shooter beyond them being dressed as a clown. After taking a deep breath and collecting himself, Joey would say that the shooter had a lot of white makeup on, like even more makeup than a circus clown would wear, so as a result, it was almost impossible to tell what the shooter actually looked like. But Joey said, as far as he could tell, the shooter was a man who was probably about 5'9" tall, and he had what looked like really big hands. Joey's friends would agree with that description. Detective Harrison said this was extremely helpful, and then he asked them if there was anything else they remembered. Joey just shook his head, and his friend said that was all they could think of. But then, Joey looked up at Harrison like something had just come back to him. He said there actually was one thing that really stood out, but he hadn't really thought about it at the time. Joey said when the clown came to the door, there was a part of his costume that seemed a bit off. Instead of wearing the typical oversized clown shoes, this clown was wearing black combat boots. This was an interesting piece of information, but it didn't really surprise Harrison. The detective figured the shooter had planned this whole shooting out, and they knew they would need to make a quick getaway, and trying to run back to their car in giant clown shoes would have been very difficult. Harrison thanked Joey and his friends for their help, and as they walked away, Harrison just could not imagine what Joey must have felt witnessing his mother get shot like that right in front of him. Harrison walked over to the neighbor who had been out walking his dog at the time of the shooting. The man would tell Harrison that he only heard a single gunshot. He also said he was sure the shooter had sped off in a white Chrysler LeBaron that didn't have a license plate. Harrison thanked the neighbor, and then he made one of the weirdest phone calls he'd ever made in his entire law enforcement career. He contacted the sheriff's department and asked them to issue a BOLO, which is a be on the lookout message to other law enforcement agencies and the general public. Harrison said the BOLO should let people know they were searching for a white Chrysler LeBaron that was being driven by a clown. Harrison made his way inside of Marlene's house, and right away he was stunned at just how little evidence there was, considering a shooting had taken place right there. There was very minimal blood in the entryway, and there were no bullet casings, no weapon, and no bullet holes in the wall. Harrison still needed to get some information from the hospital where Marlene had been taken, but based on his conversation with the neighbor, and also based on what he saw at the crime scene, Harrison's first impression of this crime was that the clown, the shooter, fired one bullet, and that bullet must be lodged somewhere in Marlene's body. The lack of ballistics evidence and the fact that the shooter was fully disguised meant that Harrison and his team did not have a lot to go on. But he crouched down in the entryway and focused on the evidence he did have, the balloons and the basket of flowers. One of the balloons was pretty generic, but the other one was red, heart-shaped, and had a message on it that said, "You're the greatest." For now, that balloon was the best clue Harrison had. So he instructed his team to cover every place in the area that sold balloons to see which of those places sold heart-shaped balloons like the one left behind at the scene. Harrison's team worked fast, and his tactic paid off. Later that day, he learned there was only one grocery store in town that sold that particular balloon. So Harrison had his first major break in his search for the clown who had shot Marlene. Members of the investigative team went to the grocery store where they believed the balloon left at Marlene's house had come from, and one of the clerks there remembered selling the balloon and flowers to someone about an hour and a half before Marlene was shot. Now, the clerk could not provide a description of the person who bought these items, but this information was still very valuable because now Detective Harrison thought there was a strong possibility that their shooter, the clown, was somebody local, that they would have known to come to this particular grocery store to get that particular balloon and those flowers. And so with that theory in mind, that their shooter was local, Harrison turned his attention to local costume shops. If the shooter purchased the balloons and flowers in town, then they very likely got their clown costume locally too. And later that day, a bell jangled over Harrison's head when he walked through the door of a small, dimly lit costume shop. He walked past shelves of masks and racks filled with all different kinds of costumes, and at the back of the shop, he found two young women sitting behind a large glass counter that had costume makeup displayed in it. Harrison introduced himself to the young women, and they were clearly very surprised to see a detective in their store. Harrison told them they had nothing to worry about and that he just had a couple of basic questions for them. Then he asked both of them if they recalled selling a clown costume recently. The women looked at each other and their eyes went wide. Then one of the young women turned back to Harrison and told him they'd actually just been talking about a clown costume that they had sold a couple of nights earlier. She said the costume itself was not the weird part. It was the customer who bought it that made the whole transaction so strange. She said this customer had come into the shop while they were locking up for the night, and so the women had told this customer they were closed, but this person said they were desperate to get a clown costume, and they had to have it right now. The young women could tell this customer seemed very, very anxious and on edge, and so ultimately they decided to help. They walked the customer to the back of the store and showed them the clown costumes they had, and eventually the customer found the costume they liked, and they also bought a red curly wig, a clown nose, and a bunch of white makeup. Harrison asked if this customer had also bought clown shoes, and one of the women said actually that was another interesting thing about this transaction. The customer had been so adamant that they wanted a full clown costume, but then when it was time to actually get the clown costume, they said they did not want the shoes that came with it. So Harrison asked for a description of this customer. But both women said, it was the strangest thing. When this customer came in, it was like they already were in disguise because they had a hat pulled down over their face and they had their jacket pulled up high around their neck and they kept looking down and barely speaking. And so, the two women just did not have a clue what this person looked like. They couldn't really even tell if it was a man or a woman. But what they could recall was that this person was maybe 5'8" or 5'9", and they appeared to have some brown hair, but they didn't know how long it was. While this description obviously was not very helpful, it did kind of match the description that Marlene's son, Joey, had given of the clown that shot his mother. He basically described an average-sized man, and that seemed like that's what the customer was. Harrison hoped this customer had bought the clown stuff using a credit card, and then he could just kind of follow the credit card transaction history right to the shooter. But unfortunately, when he asked the women for the credit card receipt, they said that the customer had paid in cash, and so there was no paper trail. So Harrison thanked the two young women for their time, and then he headed back outside and made his way back to the sheriff's department. The next day, so May 27th, 1990, the day after the shooting, Detective Harrison led Marlene's husband, Michael, into a small office at the sheriff's station. Michael looked dazed and like he hadn't slept in a long time. The day before, Michael had been halfway to Miami when he got a call on his car phone. That was how he had learned his wife had been shot. Michael had turned around immediately and sped to the hospital to be with Marlene, and he had stayed with Marlene the entire time until Harrison had asked him to come to the sheriff's station. Harrison sat down across from Michael. The detective knew Michael had an airtight alibi, having been on the road when the shooting took place, but when a violent crime is committed, spouses are often the first suspect. So even if Michael didn't pull the trigger, Harrison could not yet rule out that he was involved in some way. And even if Michael wasn't connected to the shooting, Harrison hoped Michael could provide some key information that might push the investigation forward. Harrison asked Michael if he had any idea who would want to hurt his wife, but Michael looked like he barely even heard the question. He just said he wished the shooter had gotten him instead of Marlene. He said she was such a good person and everybody loved her. Detective Harrison said he understood how hard this was for Michael, but he asked the question again. Did he know of anybody who might want to hurt his wife? Michael finally slumped over and he rubbed his eyes. He took a minute to either think or collect himself, and then he looked back up at Harrison. Michael said the only thing he could think of had to do with his and Marlene's real estate business. They had several rental properties, and periodically they would have to evict people from these properties. And because Marlene managed the real estate business, she was the one who handled these evictions. And people who get evicted don't like being evicted. There's lots of opportunity for conflict. So Michael thought it was possible that maybe an angry former tenant who had been evicted by Marlene had attacked Marlene to get some kind of revenge on her for getting kicked out of their apartment. That made sense to Harrison, and so he made a note to have his team look into all the people Marlene had evicted over the years. Then he asked Michael if he and his wife had been fighting recently or if their marriage was strained in any way. Michael said he would do anything for his wife, and vice versa. He said sure, they argued like any married couple did, but it was usually just over small stuff, and they always made up, and they loved each other. Then Michael told Harrison that what he really wanted right now was just to be back at the hospital with his wife. Harrison nodded and thanked Michael for coming to the station, and then let him leave to go back to his wife. Later that day, members of Harrison's team started tracking down the names and locations of the people who Marlene had evicted, and who might, because of that eviction, have a grudge against her. And Detective Harrison reached out to Marlene's friends and family to see if they might know something that Michael was unaware of or forgot to mention. And in doing that, Harrison got one piece of information that completely threw him for a loop. Apparently, Marlene loved clowns. Marlene's parents told Harrison that when Marlene was little, she had clown decorations all over her room and she was always drawing pictures of clowns, and they said this love of clowns did not go away when Marlene got older. She would still get very excited if she saw a clown or if she heard the circus was in town. And so Detective Harrison still thought looking into disgruntled former tenants made a lot of sense, but this new information sparked a different idea about the case for him. Had someone who knew Marlene really well tried to kill her dressed up as the one thing that she loved? Who would do that? It's so dark and twisted. The following day, so May 28th, 2 days after the shooting, Marlene's family made the heartbreaking decision to take Marlene off of life support, and so Marlene passed away in the hospital. It was Memorial Day, and Marlene's son, Joey, knew it was the kind of holiday that his mom would have loved to celebrate by hosting another big backyard barbecue for her friends and family. Joey had held on to hope that his mom would survive this ordeal, but now that she was gone, Joey just felt lost. The family dealt with the shock of losing a wife, mother, and child, and at the same time, Detective Harrison now knew he had a homicide case on his hands. But at least he felt like he had a few decent leads. For example, his team was able to locate all the people Marlene had evicted, so Harrison pursued the idea that this could have been a grudge killing. But Harrison found himself feeling more surprised after he spoke to each of these evicted former tenants. Even though Marlene had kicked them out of their apartments, they all still spoke very fondly of her. They said she was a genuinely good person and a decent landlord. Some said they had even remained friends with Marlene after they had been evicted. Harrison couldn't actually rule any of them out yet, but during all those interviews with these former tenants, he never felt like he was talking to a killer. Then, on May 30th, so 4 days after the shooting, Harrison got a major break in the case. The white Chrysler LeBaron car, the car the clown had jumped into and sped off in that Joey had chased after and couldn't find, well, that car was found. A little after 9:30 a.m., Detective Harrison and county forensics investigators arrived at a grocery store parking lot where the car had been abandoned. The car didn't have any license plates on it, so instead, Harrison called in the vehicle identification number, or VIN number, that's assigned to every vehicle, and you can find it typically on the inside of your car door. He called that number in to his department so they could begin to try to look it up, at the same time that the forensics team began to comb through this car to look for evidence. And at some point, one of the forensics investigators who was in the driver's side of the car called out to Harrison, and so Harrison walked over to the driver's door, and the investigator pointed out red fibers on the door, and then showed Harrison that more of those same red fibers had been found in the driver's seat. They would need to run tests to confirm this, but everybody at the scene felt confident those red fibers must have come from the red clown wig the shooter was seen wearing. The forensics investigators continued their sweep of the car, and they would also find 2 strands of brown hair. They bagged the red fibers and brown hair as evidence, and then prepared them to be sent off to an FBI crime lab to be analyzed. At the time, DNA testing was still in its early days, and so hair analysis was also very limited. The FBI had greater testing capabilities than the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Department, but Harrison knew there was still no guarantee that these hair samples would actually lead him anywhere. Still, they had a car that matched the description of the one that had been seen speeding away from the crime scene, and they had red fibers that could match the description of the red clown wig, and Harrison believed the shooter had brown hair based on the description he'd gotten from the two young women at the costume shop, and they had those brown hairs that were found in the car. So it seemed clear to Harrison that they had found the shooter's car, and he wouldn't have to wait for the FBI's test results to find a connection between that car and the victim. Police ran that vehicle identification number, and they discovered that the LeBaron was a rental car. And about a month earlier, it had been returned to the used car dealership that Marlene's husband, Michael, owned. Harrison left the grocery store parking lot and quickly went back to the station. But when he arrived, he discovered that the story surrounding the LeBaron was a lot stranger than he'd imagined. It would turn out the LeBaron had not originally been rented from Michael's company. Instead, the couple who had rented this LeBaron had apparently accidentally called Michael's company and asked where they should drop the car off when they returned it, and somebody at Michael's company, who was used to cars getting returned all the time, and so did not think to ask this couple, hey, did you rent with us or did you rent somewhere else? They just told the couple, okay, yeah, just leave the car at this specific location and leave the keys inside. Harrison didn't know what to make of this. He thought it would have been a lot more cut and dry if the car simply belonged to Michael's company, but now he needed to figure out if this was all just some bizarre coincidence that, the killers happened to drop off the car at Michael's company by accident, or if Michael, or one of his employees for that matter, had taken this opportunity to get a hold of a car that they thought would not be traced back to them. So Harrison went to interview some of Michael's employees, and he thought he found another potential suspect when he spoke to Sheila and Richard Keene, the young couple who had been at Marlene's barbecue, who had walked up to Marlene when she was at the grill and they had asked her if she was doing okay. Also the same couple that Marlene's mother-in-law had sort of warned Marlene about, saying that, Sheila was young and pretty, so be cautious of her. But Marlene was actually thinking, Sheila's not the problem, it's Richard. He's this big intimidating repo man guy. Harrison and his team dug into Sheila and Richard's background, and they would discover that Richard had a criminal record. And in virtue of him being a repo man who worked all over the area, he would know his way around the neighborhood, and he could have easily figured out a route to quickly escape Marlene's neighborhood, and he probably would have had a good idea where to abandon the getaway car where it wouldn't be found for at least a few days. But after actually meeting with Richard, Harrison couldn't find anything linking him directly to Marlene's shooting. And there was no evidence that Richard was the employee at Michael's company who had taken that call about returning the LeBaron and then told the renters where to leave it. So, over the next couple of weeks, Harrison continued to pursue leads connected to Michael and his business, but he started to feel like the answers to this case were just out of his grasp. He had a strong hunch that either Michael or someone who worked for him was behind the shooting, but the evidence just wasn't coming together. And news from the FBI did very little to point Harrison in the right direction. Test results did show that the red fibers found in the LeBaron were most likely from a wig, but the two strands of brown hair that investigators had also found could not be analyzed fully enough to identify who they belonged to. And so after all this work that Harrison and his team had done, they still basically had very little to go on. So Harrison decided to keep digging into Michael's used car dealership because he still thought the abandoned white LeBaron was the strongest clue they had. Detective Harrison and his team spent the months following Marlene's murder delving into her husband Michael's business practices at his used car dealership, and they found significant evidence of illegal activity. Now, it was nothing that tied Michael or any of his employees to Marlene's murder, but still there was way too much evidence of these other crimes for Harrison to just overlook. So on October 26, 1990, exactly 5 months after Marlene's murder, Michael was arrested on multiple charges including racketeering, auto theft, and filing false insurance claims. Michael's attorney argued that the only reason police made the arrest was because they were frustrated with their own inability to find Marlene's killer. Michael would eventually be sentenced to 4 years in prison, but during all that time, Detective Harrison did not get any closer to identifying the person who had murdered Marlene. Harrison had a strong hunch about who he thought had done it, but he didn't have the clear-cut evidence to back it up. And as more time went by, stories of the killer clown in the upscale Florida neighborhood seemed more like a strange urban legend than an active, actual homicide investigation. And eventually, the killer clown case went cold, and it would stay that way for decades. But 23 years after Marlene's murder, so in 2013, the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Department received a federal grant of $125,000. The grant money was to be used to help solve cold cases, and one of the very first cold cases the department reopened was Marlene's murder. The new investigators started by reviewing all of the evidence and putting the case back together piece by piece. They located and re-interviewed past suspects and witnesses, and they also tracked down Marlene's husband, Michael, who was now living in Tennessee with his new wife, a blonde woman named Debbie. But early on in the new investigation, police still could not find any evidence that pointed them in the right direction. But like Detective Harrison before them, the new investigative team could not shake the connection between Michael's used car dealership and the white Chrysler LeBaron that the clown had used as a getaway car. And they were convinced if they kept looking into that connection, they would eventually discover something that would pay off. It took a few more years, but they were right. Their method did finally pay off. In December of 2016, so over 26 years after Marlene's murder, detectives from the Palm Beach Sheriff's Department traveled to Tennessee, and they would follow local police to an establishment called the Purple Cow, a fast food burger place that Michael and his new wife Debbie owned. The investigators spoke to current employees about the couple, and everybody talked about what incredible bosses Michael and Debbie were, and what a great place the Purple Cow was to work. So the detectives left the fast food restaurant and met up with former employees of the Purple Cow, thinking maybe they would be more candid about their experience with Michael and Debbie. And inside of a small house in Tennessee, the Florida investigators met with a former Purple Cow employee who said he had all the details from an insane conversation Michael's new wife, Debbie, had had with a friend of his. The information this former employee provided about this drunken conversation led investigators to dig through photos that had been taken at the Purple Cow. And one of those photos leapt out at the investigators, and they were sure they had finally found proof of who killed Marlene. Still, investigators were not willing to put an entire case on the line with a single photograph, especially for a case that dated back almost 27 years. They wanted scientific evidence to back up their claims. So they reached out to the FBI. DNA testing and hair analysis had taken massive leaps forward since Detective Harrison's initial investigation into this case back in 1990. And so this time, when the FBI tested the 2 strands of brown hair that had been found inside of the abandoned white Chrysler LeBaron, they were able to find a clear match. And the person those tests pointed to was the same person investigators had seen in the Purple Cow photo. And that person was Marlene's killer. Based on those DNA tests, the infamous Purple Cow photo, and evidence collected across 27 years, here is a reconstruction of what investigators believe happened to Marlene Warren on the morning she was killed, May 26, 1990. On that day, so May 26th, the killer dipped a small triangle-shaped sponge into a container of clown makeup. The killer then ran the sponge across their face over and over again, painting their face white. The process took a while, but they wanted to be sure that any of their recognizable facial features disappeared under all their makeup. When they were satisfied with the makeup, the killer took a clean sponge, dipped it in red makeup, and gave themselves big red dots on their cheeks and also a wide red smile. The killer fitted a red curly wig on their head and tucked their brown hair underneath it. Then they added the final touch, a clown nose. The killer then looked in the mirror. They were sure nobody would know who they were. Finally, they picked up 2 balloons and a basket of flowers off the floor, they grabbed their .38 caliber handgun off the makeup table, and they headed out the door. At around 11 a.m., the killer clown drove a white Chrysler LeBaron past the mansions in Marlene's neighborhood. The killer was nervous, but they told themselves they had the perfect disguise, so there was nothing to worry about. The killer eventually pulled up in front of Marlene's house. There was a car that was already on the long circular driveway, so the killer parked the LeBaron on the street. The killer glanced in the rearview mirror just to make sure their costume and wig were all in place. Then they stepped out of the car and they opened up the back driver's side door. They reached inside and grabbed the balloons and flowers in one hand, and they grabbed the gun with the other. The killer clown then walked up the driveway towards the front door, hiding the gun behind the basket of flowers. The clown stepped onto the porch and slipped their gun behind their back. Then they took a deep breath and rang the doorbell. A moment later, the door opened, and the killer clown saw Marlene standing there. The killer gave a huge clown smile and handed Marlene the flowers and balloons. Marlene beamed and said, "Oh, how pretty," and then began looking through the flowers for a card to see who sent it. And it was at this point that the killer clown quickly swung their arm out from behind their back, they raised their gun up, aimed it at Marlene's head, and fired. The bullet tore through Marlene's head, and she crumpled to the floor. Screams came from inside the house, and the killer turned and ran back towards their Chrysler. Once they were inside, they hit the gas and sped off. But not long after that, they heard a car racing down the street behind them. The killer glanced in the rearview mirror and saw somebody was in pursuit. So the killer turned off Marlene's street and sped through the neighborhood and lost whoever was following them in the process. Once they were sure they were not being tailed anymore, the killer made their way across town and parked the LeBaron in a grocery store parking lot. Then they got into another car that they had stashed there and they drove off. Not long after that, the killer was back at home washing off all their makeup. The killer knew Marlene's husband, Michael, would get the news about his wife soon, and he would be very upset. But the killer just didn't worry too much about that. Now that she had gotten Marlene out of the way, all she had to do was divorce her own husband, and soon she and Michael could be together forever without having to hide it. Sheila Keene, Michael's young, pretty employee, who Marlene's mother-in-law had specifically warned Marlene about, murdered Marlene. It turned out that Sheila and Michael had been having an affair. They had done their best to hide it from Marlene and Sheila's husband, but Sheila had grown tired of not being able to live the life she wanted with the man she loved. So she disguised herself as a clown to hide her identity and killed her romantic rival. Early on in Detective Harrison's investigation, so the initial investigation, he had believed he was looking for a man because of descriptions he had gotten from witnesses. But the large clown costume and thick white makeup had made it basically impossible for anyone to actually get a good look at the shooter, so no one really knew if it was a man or a woman. It was just this running assumption that it had to be a man. But eventually, Detective Harrison had stopped thinking about the various descriptions he had gotten from witnesses because he basically thought they were not reliable, and instead, he had begun to consider Sheila as a major suspect because he was almost certain she and Michael were having an affair. But there simply wasn't enough evidence at the time to credibly tie Sheila to the murder, so the case had gone cold. Decades later, when the sheriff's department reopened the case, they discovered that Michael was remarried to this blonde woman named Debbie. But when police tracked down the couple's marriage certificate, they learned that blonde-haired Debbie was actually brown-haired Sheila. Michael and Sheila had married just a few years after Michael had gotten out of prison, and so this was obviously a huge red flag for investigators. It took a while, but they eventually met with that former Purple Cow employee in Tennessee, and he would say that one night Sheila, who he knew as Debbie, had gotten totally drunk and told his friend that she had once dressed up as a clown and killed a woman in Florida. And not long after that, investigators found that infamous photo of Sheila working at the Purple Cow drive-thru wearing clown makeup. And so investigators were convinced Sheila had to be Marlene's killer, and soon the FBI confirmed that she was. They ran new tests on the brown hair that had been found in the Chrysler LeBaron, and they were able to match that hair to Sheila's hair. And so in September of 2017, over 27 years after Marlene's murder, investigators tracked Sheila down and put her under arrest. In April of 2023, Sheila pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. She was sentenced to 12 years in prison, but she could get out as early as the summer of 2024. Some of the investigators involved still suspect that Michael must have played a role in this murder, but there was no evidence found that linked him to the crime, and so he was never charged. Michael also maintains that despite Sheila's plea deal, she is innocent and was wrongfully accused. 1985, 36-year-old Michael Reamer was a roofer in Tacoma, Washington, and his boss described him as being a work hard, play hard type of guy. In the winter months, when there really wasn't any roofing to be done, Mike would supplement his income by trapping coyote, mink, and muskrat in the forest that butted up against the Nisqually River, which was an 80-mile stretch that ran right near his home. Most of the traps Mike would set would be far away from any actual trail, because wherever there was a trail, you would have human foot traffic, and that would scare away the animals that you're trying to catch in your trap. And so as a result, he would place his traps in very remote, isolated sections of the forest, which meant he needed to know where those sections were. And so over the 15 years he spent trapping in this forest, he got really, really good at navigating it. It was like he had a map in his head of where everything was in this forest. Plus, Mike was already an avid outdoorsman, and so navigating a forest and being out in the wild was something that just kind of came naturally to him. Mike's girlfriend was a 21-year-old woman named Diana Robertson, and they had a 2-year-old daughter named Crystal. Mike and Diana had a rocky relationship, to say the least. In fact, in October of that year, Diana had filed a restraining order against Mike after he had kicked in the door and thrown her to the ground. Mike also always carried a gun on him, and he had a very quick temper. But despite their significant relationship issues, the one thing they could always see eye to eye on was their daughter, Crystal. They adored her, and when it came to decisions about her, they were always on the same page. It was whatever is in the best interest of Crystal. In December of that year, Diana and Mike were able to reconcile, and so Diana threw the restraining order out. And in fact, she and Crystal moved back in with Mike, which made Crystal very, very happy. Just a couple of days after moving back in, they decided they wanted to go out and go camping together as a family, and then also pick out a real Christmas tree they could bring back for the holidays. And so they settled on an area that was going to be in the same forest where Mike had all of his traps set, and they figured they could, get their family time in, they could get their Christmas tree, and Mike would be able to check his traps, saving himself from making another trip later on. So on December 12th, the three of them loaded up into Mike's red pickup truck, and they drove the 30 minutes down towards Nisqually River, where there was this logging road that Mike would use to park his truck and then walk in to check his traps. So Mike pulls over on the side of the road, they all hop out, and Mike leads the way right into the middle of the woods. There's no trail. Mike is just bringing them to an area where, 1, his traps will be, and 2, he thinks is suitable for camping and for looking for a Christmas tree. Later that afternoon, Crystal was spotted walking around a parking lot of a Kmart 20 miles away from where Mike had parked the car near Nisqually River. And she's just walking around, she looks totally confused, she's all alone, and the employees of the Kmart are looking out, and they see this girl, and they're all watching, waiting for, her parents or a guardian or someone to walk over and show that they are with this girl. But after a couple of minutes, when no one does that, one of the employees goes out and tries to talk to her. And this employee would say when she talked to the girl, she kept looking over her shoulder and she was just terrified the whole time. And so this employee asked her, what's your name? And she didn't say anything. She asked her, where are you coming from? Where are your parents? Who's looking after you? And to all the questions she was asked, she didn't say anything. She just looked terrified and was looking over her shoulder. And so this employee brings the girl back inside and they call the police. And so the police show up and they ask the girl the same questions that the employees have been asking her, and the girl's still not speaking. And so after they made an announcement inside to say, hey, is anybody in here the parent or guardian of this child? And no one came forward. They said, okay, well, we have no other choice, but we're going to have to move her to temporary foster care. And so they move her to a foster home, and then they put an ad out in the newspaper that day with a picture of her, basically saying, if you know me, contact this number. 2 days later, Crystal's maternal grandmother would see the picture in the newspaper, and the ad did not have a description of, how she was discovered. It just said she had been found at this particular Kmart, and if you know who she is, please contact this number. Even without the details, the grandmother knows something has gone wrong, because there's no reason in the world those two parents would abandon their beloved Crystal. And so she calls Diana, she calls Mike, they don't pick up the phone. That's when she calls the number and she says, what's going on? I'm her grandmother, where is she? The police tell her to go to the foster home and they will meet her there and they're going to talk about what happened. So the grandmother flies to the foster home and she arrives there before the police. She goes inside and Crystal is so happy to see her. It's the first time Crystal has really broken out of that kind of catatonic state she had been in ever since she was found at the Kmart. So she runs up to her grandmother, they have this reunion, and the grandmother's so happy to see Crystal, but she's also thinking, where are your parents? Where are Diana and Mike? And so she asks Crystal, where are they, honey? Where is your mom? Where's your dad? And Crystal would speak to her grandmother and she would say, Mommy's in the trees. Her grandmother didn't know what this meant, and so she tried to ask clarifying questions, but Crystal was not very verbal. She was not able to articulate more than what she was saying, so she just kept repeating it, saying, "Mommy's in the trees, mommy's in the trees." And so then the police show up, and the grandmother turns to them and she says, "Where are her parents? Where are Mike and Diana?" And the police turn to her and they're like, "We don't know. We found her abandoned in this parking lot and she wasn't speaking and no one knew anything about her. And so until right now, we didn't even know her parents' names. Do you have any idea where they might be?" And the grandmother's like, "I have no idea. I mean, I'm just learning about all of this stuff now. But when I came over here, Crystal said to me, 'Mommy's in the trees.'" And, she's not very verbal, so she can't explain much more than that. But she just kept saying, "Mommy's in the trees." And I know Mike liked to go camping in this one area near the Nisqually River. He keeps traps out near the edge of the water. He catches some small animals out there. So I know he goes out there and goes camping. And so maybe that's what Crystal's referencing, that they were in the trees. So they were in that forest over there. The grandmother also gave the police the address to Mike's house, and the police used that information to launch their search for the parents. And so the first place they go is Mike's house, and all the lights are off, the door is locked, and his red pickup truck, because the grandmother said he drove a red pickup truck, his red pickup truck is not there. And so they rule out his house, they're not there, and they begin flying a plane not only over Tacoma, which is the area where they were living, but also over that forest that was right up against the Nisqually River. And as they're flying, they're looking for campsites that could potentially be Mike and Diana, but they're also looking for the red pickup truck, which is fairly distinctive. And after a couple of days of flying all over the forest and looking around the side streets and putting people in the forest walking on foot, they couldn't find anything and they turned the search off. And they would tell the grandmother and the rest of the family on Diana's and Mike's side that they really just needed to wait for more information to come in because they couldn't just spend an indefinite amount of time scanning a fairly large area. They have all of Tacoma and this huge forest. And so everyone just had to wait. 2 months later, a man and his dog were out walking on this logging road that was about 10 miles away from the Nisqually River and 30 miles away from the Kmart where Crystal was found. And they're walking on this road and they see way off in the distance, there's this truck that's pulled over to the side of this road. And even from a distance, they can tell it's covered in snow. But it hasn't snowed recently. There's snow on the ground, but the amount of snow that is on this truck indicates it's been sitting here for quite a while. And so as they get closer to the truck, this man is looking around, seeing if maybe the owner is nearby, even though it seemed unlikely given the fact that it looks like it's been sitting here a while. And so after he stands there for a minute looking around, feeling pretty confident there's no one in the area, he brushes the snow off the passenger side window and he looks inside and he doesn't see anything at first, but he notices on the passenger front seat, there's a significant amount of blood on the seat, or what appears to be blood. And this startles the guy, so he backs up from it and he and his dog very quickly leave this area because they're in this kind of desolate, logging road. He's pretty isolated. And so he gets out of there as quickly as he can. And when he gets to a phone, he calls the police. Police show up and they brush the rest of the snow off and they find it is a red pickup truck. It's Mike's red pickup truck. Mike and Diana's case had been very big news in the area when it happened, and the news had really not gone away. People were out there looking for this couple. And so as soon as they saw this was Mike's truck, they start fanning out and searching the area, seeing if they can find any other clues about what happened to Mike and Diana. And very quickly, they discovered Diana's body. She was located not far from the red truck, just barely off the road in the forest. She was under several inches of snow, and she had been stabbed 17 times, and there was a tube sock wrapped around her neck. There was no sign of Mike, but once they got inside the truck, there was a manila folder that had been tucked up on the dashboard that just said, "I love you, Diana." When police showed that message to Diana's family, they all said, "That looks like Mike's handwriting. He used to send us handwritten Christmas cards, and that looks exactly the way he writes." As for the blood that was on the passenger seat inside the truck, it had been sitting out for too long, so they weren't able to determine whose blood it was, but they were able to determine it was human. So between the blood on the front seat, the note that was left on the dashboard, the personal furious nature of the way in which Diana was killed, combined with Mike's history of violence and his disappearance, because he's not here anymore, that all made it seem an awful lot like Mike was the guy that did this. In fact, this made for a very tidy ending to a mystery that had actually started before Diana had been killed. On August 10th, 1985, so 4 months before Mike, Diana, and Crystal ventured off into the woods near Nisqually River, 27-year-old Stephen Harkins and his girlfriend, 42-year-old Ruth Cooper, were going camping near Nisqually River in the same forest. They were actually about 15 miles from where Diana's body was ultimately found. and they were very close to a number of Mike's traps, although they probably didn't realize they were near them. During their trip, an unknown assailant walked up to their campsite in the middle of the night and shot them both to death. Stephen was found right away, and he was found inside of his sleeping bag at their campsite, indicating he had been killed in his sleep. Ruth wasn't found for months, and when she was found 1.5 miles away from the campsite, and she had a tube sock tied around her neck, the same way Diana had. And the knot that was used on the tube sock was even the same as the knot used on Diana's tube sock. So the similarity was just too much to overlook. And so to the police, they're thinking, Mike has to be the guy in both of these cases. He attacked Ruth and Stephen, perhaps because they were, on his territory where his traps were, and he didn't like that. He has a history of violence, and so he attacks them. And then a couple months later, he attacks Diana, and then he flees. As for his daughter being found alive at the Kmart, it would seem he just did not have it in him to harm his own child, and so he dropped her off at the Kmart before he ultimately fled. Despite everything seeming to fit just perfectly to where, yep, Mike is definitely the guy, not only for Diana, but for Ruth and for Stephen, we figured it out. Despite that being the overwhelming feeling, there were a couple of questions that remained unanswered, like the FBI. They were unable to confirm the handwriting on that folder that said, "I love you, Diana." They were unable to confirm that in fact was Mike's handwriting. Diana's family was really convinced it was his, but the FBI said it's not necessarily a match. And then you have the motives for the two crimes. We can understand one of them. Him attacking Diana, unfortunately, people attack their partners all the time, and so we can understand that. We can rationalize that. But for him to attack Ruth and Stephen, two total strangers, because they encroached on your land, even though it's not your land, it's public land, and you just happen to put your traps out there, that didn't seem like a strong enough reason for him to want to kill them. But the circumstantial evidence was overwhelmingly pointing at Mike being the guy. You have the fact that he's this violent guy with a history of domestic abuse. He knows this area well where both crimes were committed. You have the tube sock tied around Diana the same way it's tied around Ruth. It just had to be Mike. And so because the police felt so strongly it had to be Mike, they were willing to overlook these lingering questions. And so the police wanted to issue an arrest warrant for Mike, but they needed to be able to prove he was alive, because if he was dead, then that calls into question his ability to have committed these two crimes. And so they didn't have proof he was alive. And so very quickly, this story faded out of the headlines because basically everybody believed Mike had done it and he had run off somewhere, and maybe someday we'll figure out where he went and we'll bring him to justice. But until then, we know he's the guy. For years, no one heard from Mike. No one saw Mike. It was like he had just totally vanished. Crystal was raised by relatives, and many of the detectives that were working on these cases eventually retired or moved on. Then, 25 years later, in March of 2011, a hiker was walking through the forest near the Nisqually River, about 1 mile from where Diana's body was found, and they would stumble upon a piece of a human skull. She calls the police show up, they search the area, and they discover another bone, a human jawbone. And it would turn out it was Mike's. The rest of Mike's remains were never found, and because there was so little of him to work with, police were not able to determine a cause of death. However, they were able to date his death back to almost exactly the same time frame that Diana had died. Additionally, investigators believe the reason they did not find more of Mike's remains is because he had been buried. The two bones that were found, the skull and the jawbone, they were located within 1 mile of where Diana's body had been found, and that area, after Diana had been found, had been scoured. They looked everywhere for clues, and because he apparently died at the same time she did, he would have been out there and they would have found him. So the fact that they didn't find him can only mean he was underground. So this all meant Mike could not have been the killer, because in order for him to have been the killer, he not only would have had to attack Diana and then drive his daughter to the Kmart and then drive back to the forest, he would then need to take his own life and then also somehow bury himself. Some of the police officers that had worked that case were still on the police force, and so when they heard this news about Mike not being the killer, they were like, it never really made any sense that he would attack Ruth or Stephen unless he was a serial killer. And then it clicked. They probably were dealing with a serial killer. It just wasn't Mike. And their only eyewitness was the toddler, Crystal, who apparently the serial killer could not bring themselves to harm. And so as a result, Crystal just sat there and watched these horrible things happen to her parents, and then probably spent a fair amount of time with the serial killer afterwards because they needed to drive her to the Kmart. Investigators and her family had tried to get her to give more information about what she had witnessed, but all she could say was, "Mommy's in the trees." And so there are really only two interpretations of what that means. Either one, she was just stating that her mother was in the forest, and that would have been accurate, or she's remembering her mother trying to escape a serial killer by climbing up into a tree. Or maybe even that she was in the tree with her mother as they both were trying to escape a serial killer with a knife. So when the police have this revelation that Mike was not the killer, that in fact, it was probably a serial killer, and we know nothing about this serial killer besides what Crystal had to say as a toddler, and that didn't provide any sort of real clarity on who this person was or what their MO was. They went back and looked at all the unsolved murders in the Pacific Northwest, specifically around this forest. They discovered that in addition to Mike and Diana and Ruth and Stephen, there were 4 other sets of couples that were killed in and around this forest, and all of them bared striking resemblances to one another. The most recent attack that is associated with the tube sock killer occurred in 2006, but the reality is police don't really know anything about the tube sock killer. All they know is that they're probably in the Pacific Northwest, and they are definitely still at large. Today, the next and final story of today's episode is called Where Did He Go? In mid-August 2013, Mike and Karen Laspisa helped their beloved only child, 19-year-old Bryce Laspisa, get all of his things packed up and into the family car. Bryce had just spent the summer with his parents in their home in Laguna Niguel, California, which is one of the nicest places to live in the entire country. But now that the summer was coming to an end, it was time for Bryce to head back to Sierra College in Rocklin, California, where he was set to start his sophomore year. Once all of his things were packed inside the trunk of the car, all 3 of them hopped inside and then made the 7-hour drive north to his campus. Once his parents had moved him into his apartment, they gave him a hug and a kiss and wished him luck, and then they left. On their ride back home, Mike and Karen talked about how well their son seemed to be doing. He loved his school, he loved the program he was in graphic design, he was a very gifted artist, he had lots of friends, he had a wonderful girlfriend. It just seemed like he was living his best life and he was on the path to success. So nothing could prepare them for what their son did 2 weeks later. Just a couple of days after getting dropped off at school, Bryce's very close friend and roommate, Sean, and Bryce's girlfriend, Kim, noticed Bryce was acting erratically. Specifically, he was drinking a ton of hard alcohol. Now, Bryce was no saint. He liked to drink and party like many other kids his age did, but the amount of alcohol he was consuming was concerning. Also, Bryce began experimenting with a drug called Vyvanse, which is a very powerful stimulant that's normally used to treat attention deficit disorder. Now, Bryce didn't have attention deficit disorder. He was taking it in order to stay up late at night and play video games. But between the heavy drinking and the drug use, it seemed like Bryce's personality was starting to change. He was becoming anxious and skittish and kind of paranoid. And so finally, Sean and Kim confronted him about his substance abuse and asked him, what's going on? What's causing you to act this way? And Bryce would say, nothing, guys, I'm fine. I'm just, drinking and doing whatever I want to do. It's not a big deal. But Sean and Kim, they weren't buying it. They were convinced that something bad had happened to Bryce, and the way he was coping with it was by drinking really heavily and taking this drug. On August 28th, so about 2 weeks after Bryce has been dropped back off at school by his parents, Bryce and his roommate Sean were alone in their apartment together. And at some point, as they're sitting there just kind of minding their own business, Bryce says to Sean, "Hey, I want to give you something." And he takes his diamond earrings out and he gives them to Sean. And Sean's looking at these earrings and he's like, didn't your mom give these to you? Aren't these important to you? These are expensive. And Bryce just says, "No, I want you to have them." And so Sean is looking at these earrings, looking back at Bryce, wondering what's going on here. And then before he can even refuse the gift, Bryce is grabbing his Xbox and putting it on the table and telling Sean, "I want you to have this too. Take my Xbox." And so Sean is like, "I can't accept these two things. These are expensive. These are valuable to you. What's going on here?" But Bryce would just say, "Look, man, I want you to have these things. You're important to me and I want to give these to you." And so as Sean is sitting there wondering how to handle this very strange offering, he watched Bryce pull his phone out and begin really aggressively texting somebody. And then after a while, Bryce looks up from his phone and he tells Sean, "Hey, just so you know, I broke up with Kim." At this point, Sean knows, okay, something is definitely wrong here. There's no reason Bryce would break up with Kim. They were such a loving couple. They doted on each other. They were very close. They had just seen each other earlier in the day. Nothing seemed to be wrong. And so now Bryce is text breaking up with her. It didn't make any sense. Plus, Bryce is now trying to give him all these valuable things. It just wasn't really adding up. And so Sean decided he needed to get in touch with Bryce's parents because clearly someone needed to intervene. And so Sean waited until Bryce left. Bryce actually left to go talk to Kim. And at that point, Sean got his phone out and he looked up Bryce's parents and he called them. Bryce's mother, Karen, she picks up the phone and Sean explains that, your son, he's acting strangely. He's abusing drugs and alcohol. And I wouldn't be doing this unless I thought there was a problem. Like, I'm not trying to get him in trouble. I want you to reach out to him and see what's going on because I think there's a problem. And so Karen was alarmed by this. She had no idea any of this was going on. And she says, okay, I'll reach out to my son. Thank you for telling me. And so they hang up. And before Karen can even call Bryce, Bryce is calling her. And so Karen answers the phone, but it's not Bryce. It's Kim, his now ex-girlfriend. And she says to Karen, hey, I'm sorry to just call you like this, but your son, he just showed up at my apartment and he's acting so strangely that I actually took his keys. I don't want him to drive. There's something wrong with him. It's hard to describe, but he just seems totally off. And so now Karen's really concerned because just seconds ago, Sean has told her basically the same thing. And so Karen asks Kim, will you please put my son on the phone? Bryce picks up the phone and he says, hey, Mom. And he sounds totally normal. And she asks him, what's going on? I keep hearing that you're acting strangely. And, what are you doing over at Kim's apartment? What's going on here? And Bryce would tell his mom that, look, Mom, I just broke up with Kim. It's a very messy breakup. That's why she's calling you. She's upset. And, that's why I'm over here. We're talking about it. And look, at this point, I just really want to go home. I want to go back to my apartment, but she has my keys. Can you please tell her to give me my car keys back so I can leave? But Karen wasn't really buying it. She knew her son really well, and it just seemed totally strange that two of his very close friends in his inner circle would say the same thing independent of one another. And so she says, you know what, Bryce, look, I want you to just stay there, and I'm going to fly out there first thing tomorrow morning, and I'm going to just see what's going on out there. And at this, Bryce immediately says, no, Mom, I have a lot to talk to you about, and until I talk to you about it, I don't want you coming out here. And so Karen's like, what do you mean you have a lot to talk to me about? What is it that you have to talk to me about? I don't really understand. But Bryce refused to elaborate over the phone, which Karen thought was very odd because Bryce was remarkably forthcoming with his parents. They had a very open relationship. They were very honest with each other. So for him to not even give a hint at whatever it was that was on his mind that in some way had to do with what was going on here, it just seemed very odd and unnecessarily cryptic. And so Karen gave up trying to get more information out of her son, and instead, she put her husband on the phone. And he asked Bryce, hey, what's going on here? Are you okay? And your mom tells me there's some problem. Like, what's going on here? And Bryce again just reiterates, look, Dad, I just broke up with my girlfriend. That's all that's going on here. There's no need to be concerned. I just need one of you to tell Kim to give me my keys back so I can go back to my apartment. That's all I need right now. And so Mike felt convinced that his son was totally fine, even though it did seem odd that two of his friends had said he was acting erratically. But from Mike's perspective, Bryce seemed just fine. And so he said as much to Karen and thought, let's just get Kim to give him his keys back and he can go back to his apartment and we can talk to him later about whatever it is that's going on. And so reluctantly, Karen gets back on the phone and she asks to speak with Kim. And she says, hey, Kim, would you mind giving our son his keys back? He'd like to leave. And so Kim says, okay, I'll give him his keys. And then they hung up. And then Kim got the keys out. She gave them to Bryce and Bryce left. At about 11:30 p.m. that night, Bryce was in his car. He was getting ready to leave when his mom called him back and said, okay, look, I want you to go home, but as soon as you get there, just give me a call so I know you're safe. And Bryce said, no problem. I'll give you a call. About an hour and a half later at 1 a.m., Bryce called his mom back to let her know that he was home safe at his apartment, and Karen and Mike are totally relieved, and they tell their son, okay, we'll talk to you tomorrow morning. 10 hours later at 11 a.m. on August 29th, Karen received an automated phone call from her car insurance company letting her know that roadside assistance had been used on their 2003 Toyota Highlander car. That was Bryce's car. And so Karen's totally confused because the last she spoke to her son, he was at his apartment. He was home safe. He did not have any car problems. And so she's thinking, did he get up early this morning and get into an accident and call roadside assistance? Or maybe last night he got into car problems and just didn't tell her about it, but they were minor. And so she calls Bryce, but Bryce doesn't pick up. And so she dials his roommate, Sean. Sean does answer the phone, and she says, hey, would you mind putting Bryce on the line? But Sean says, Bryce isn't here, and he didn't come home last night. Considering the general weirdness around their son's recent behavior, this really shocked Karen and Mike. At first, they thought, we need to call the police because something horrible has happened. But then they thought, well, wait a minute, let's go into his bank statements because he has a credit card that we gave him, and let's see if there's any recent purchases that will allow us to track where he is. And so they pull up his bank statements, and his most recent charge was only a few hours earlier, and it was at a car repair shop in Buttonwillow, California, which is this small desert town right off of the I-5 highway, located about halfway between his school campus and their hometown in Laguna Niguel. And so Karen and Mike assume their son last night must not have gone to his apartment, but instead just kept on driving south in an attempt to drive all the way back home to his hometown of Laguna Niguel. I mean, after all, he did tell his mom he had a lot to talk about, and he didn't want to talk about it on the phone, and so they assumed he must be driving here to talk about whatever it was in person. And perhaps he ran into some car problems in Buttonwillow, California. That's why he pulled over. That's why there's this charge at this auto repair shop. And so Karen calls the auto repair shop in Buttonwillow, and a man who works there named Christian answered the phone. And so Karen asked him, have you seen my son? He's got red hair. He's got a tattoo on his arm. He's driving a 2003 Toyota Highlander. And Christian says, oh, yeah, we saw him a couple of hours ago. We responded to his roadside assistance call. He ran out of gas on the I-5 highway. He pulled into a rest stop, and we drove to that rest stop, and we gave him gas. And so Karen asked Christian, did my son indicate where he was going next? And Christian said, no, he didn't. We just gave him the gas and then we left. But if you'd like, I'd be more than happy to just drive over to the rest stop. It's only about 15 minutes away and see if he's still there. It's unlikely because it's been a couple of hours, but maybe. And Karen and Mike are like, oh my gosh, thank you so much. Would you do that? That would be great. And so Christian hops in his car and he drives the 15 minutes over to this rest stop. And he's not really expecting to see Bryce in this parking lot. It had been almost 3 hours. But he pulls into the lot, and there is the 2003 Toyota Highlander with Bryce sitting inside of it. He's just sitting behind the wheel, staring out into nothingness. And so Christian walks up to the driver's side, and he looks down to get Bryce's attention, and Bryce kind of snaps out of it and looks up, and he's surprised to see Christian again. He rolls the window down, and Christian says to him, hey, I just talked to your parents. They're really concerned about you. You gotta talk to them. And so Christian actually pulls out his phone and he calls Karen and says, hey, he is still here. Here he is. And he hands the phone to Bryce. And as soon as Bryce puts the phone to his ear and he says hello, Karen's like, what are you doing? What are you doing just sitting in this rest stop in the middle of Buttonwillow, California? We're so worried about you. And Bryce didn't really have an answer. He just kept telling his mom, I'm not doing anything. I'm just sitting here. And so finally his mom stops trying to get information from him and just says, look, please just fill your car up with gas and come straight home, please. And Bryce says, okay, yeah, that's what I'll do. I'll do that right now. And so Bryce hands the phone back to Christian. Christian pulls it up to his ear and he says, hey, Karen, it looks like he's leaving now, so I'm going to take off. Karen thanks him and they hang up. Christian goes back into his car. He leaves the lot, and as he's driving, he looks over at Bryce, and it didn't really look like Bryce was getting ready to leave. It looked like he had just gone back to sitting and blankly staring out of his car. But Christian figured, you know what? He just talked to his mom. He said he was going to go home. I'm sure that's what he's going to do. The drive from Buttonwillow, California, south to Laguna Niguel, California, where Bryce's parents were, was about a 3-hour trip. And so the Los Pisos were expecting their son to arrive around 3 p.m. By 3:30 p.m., when he still hadn't shown up and he still hadn't called, Karen began calling her son, but he wasn't answering the phone. And as much as Karen and Mike wanted to believe their son had just gotten stuck in traffic or something like that, they knew deep down something was wrong. Something was off about his behavior. They just didn't understand what it was. For the next several hours, they continuously tried calling their son, and he never answered the phone. And so finally, by 6 p.m. that night, when he still hadn't shown up and they still couldn't get in touch with him, they called the police and they filed an official missing person report. The police began their search by contacting Bryce's cell phone provider, AT&T, and they asked them to use their cell phone towers to ping Bryce's cell phone, basically triangulate where his phone is located. And once they did that and they had the actual location of his phone, the police and Bryce's parents were shocked at where it was. It was still in Buttonwillow, California. It was located just a couple of miles down the road from that rest stop where Christian had last seen Bryce. It was now in this parking lot of this hotel. And so the police around Buttonwillow were alerted to the fact that Bryce was a missing person and his phone was apparently in this parking lot. And so police were sent over there to see if Bryce was there too. And so the police arrive in this hotel parking lot, and sure enough, right in the middle is the 2003 Toyota Highlander with Bryce sitting behind the wheel, just sitting there staring out the front. And so an officer walks up and he knocks on the glass, and Bryce rolls the window down And the officer would say Bryce acted totally normally. He was friendly, he was lucid, he answered all their questions. When he got out of the car and they conducted field sobriety tests, he passed all of them. He even said, hey, if you want to search my car, go for it. I'm not doing anything out here. And so the officers did search his car, and there were no drugs, no alcohol, there was nothing suspicious in his car. And when they asked him, what are you doing out here? Your parents are so concerned about you. And Bryce would tell them that he was just sitting there. He didn't really have much of an answer, but he told them he planned on going home soon. And so one of the officers said to him, hey, you really need to call your mom. You need to call home and let them know that you're okay. And when they told him to do that, Bryce suddenly became really apprehensive, like he did not want to call home. And the officer picked up on it. And he said, hey, you gotta tell your family what's going on. They're the reason we're out here. They're concerned about you. So get out your phone and dial your mom. And so Bryce reluctantly pulled his phone out. He dialed his mother's number and he hit call. And the officer said, give me the phone. So Bryce hands over the phone. The officer picks it up. Karen answers the phone and the officer tells her, hey, look, I'm with your son. He's just fine. He's sober. There's no drugs. There's no alcohol. I don't really know what he's doing, but he says he's going to go home pretty soon. But there's nothing wrong about the situation that I can tell. You need to talk to your son and figure out what's going on. And so he hands the phone over to Bryce. Bryce picks it up. And Karen says to him, what's going on? Why are you still in Buttonwillow? It's been like 9 hours. And Bryce really didn't give her an answer to any of her questions. He just kind of deflected all of them and said he'd be home soon and don't worry about it. I'm just sitting here. There's nothing to worry about. And so finally, Karen just stopped trying to pull information out of her son. She could tell that, again, he was not going to tell her what's going on. And so she changed her tactic and she told her son very gently, Bryce, please just go get a bite to eat, get a cup of coffee, kind of get yourself together here, and then please just drive home. It's only a few hours away. Drive home and we can talk about whatever problems you have, but you just got to drive home. You got to leave Buttonwillow. You got to come home. And at this, Bryce says to his mom, you know what? Okay, I'm sorry. I'll be home in a few hours. And so they hang up, and the officer, who was kind of eavesdropping intentionally on this conversation to make sure everything was fine, the officer was satisfied that everything was fine, that Bryce was sober, that he would head home. And so he says, okay, Bryce, best of luck, head home to your parents. And the officer left. An hour later, Karen received a call from Christian, the car repairman who had checked on Bryce earlier. And he was actually returning one of Karen's calls. She'd called him sometime and he didn't get back to her. And so he was calling back and he wanted to know, had Bryce made it home safely? Because now it's been several hours from when he saw him last. And Karen would tell Christian, actually, no. After you left, my son did not leave Buttonwillow. He just went down the road to a parking lot. But, the police actually were just over there. They checked on him. And now I'm certain he's making his way home. Christian, who felt kind of invested in what was happening with Bryce, would say to Karen, hey, I don't mind driving over there and just confirming he has left this parking lot. But Karen would say, you know what? I'm confident he's on his way. Don't worry about it. You're too kind. So they hang up, and afterwards, Christian, even though he didn't have to, he decides, I'm going to go over there and make sure Bryce really has left, because obviously something strange is going on here. And, if there is some problem, maybe I can assist. And so he drives over to this hotel parking lot, and he really was not expecting to see Bryce there. But he pulls into the lot, and who's still in the middle of the lot but Bryce in his 2003 Toyota Highlander, just staring out the front of his car. And so this time, Christian pulls up right next to him, he parks the car, he walks right up to the window, and he's a little bit more forceful, friendly, but forceful with Bryce. He has him roll the window down, and Bryce obviously is very surprised to see Christian again. It's the third time he's seen this car repairman, and Christian says to him, hey, Bryce, you need to go home. Your parents are so worried about you. You need to leave right now. In fact, I'm going to watch you leave, and then I'm going to follow you onto the highway to make sure you're going home. And so Bryce was a little bit taken aback at how forceful he was being, but he would ultimately say, okay, yeah, all right, let's leave. And so Christian gets back in his car, and he goes right behind Bryce. And after a few seconds, Bryce pulls out of the lot and he starts driving onto the road, and Christian follows him. And for the next hour, Christian would just remain behind Bryce and watch him drive towards Laguna Niguel. And while he was driving, Christian would actually call Karen and Mike back. And he would say to them that, your son had not left, but now he's good. He's on the highway. I'm right behind him. He'll be home soon. And so when Christian and Bryce made it to the last leg on the way to Laguna Niguel, Christian was confident that Bryce was fine and he would get home under his own steam. He wasn't driving erratically. Everything seemed normal. And so Christian pulled up alongside Bryce. He kind of waved to him to say, I'm leaving. And then he turned around and he headed back to Buttonwillow. Shortly after this, Karen called Bryce. Bryce picked up the phone. He's still driving. And Karen tells him, okay, you're going to give me landmarks of the things you're seeing as you're driving so that I know you're actually driving home. But Bryce refused to give them to her. He would say, oh, I can't see anything out my window. It's too dark and I don't know where anything is. And so despite Karen and Mike getting so frustrated with him, saying, come on, tell us something, give us a sign, a road sign, anything, tell us anything around you. But Bryce didn't give them any information. And so finally, at about 2 a.m., when Bryce really should have been in Laguna Niguel or very close, he tells his parents over the phone that he's too tired to continue and he needs to pull over and take a nap. At first, his parents urged him to just keep on going. Come home. You can sleep as long as you want when you get here. But as they were saying it, they realized their son had been awake for nearly 24 hours at this point, and it's the middle of the night, so it does kind of make sense for him to pull over and take a nap. And so they say, okay, pull over, but as soon as you wake up, you need to call us so we know you're back on the road. So Bryce says, no problem, I'll do that. And they hang up. Several hours later, at 8 a.m., Karen and Mike have still not heard from their son, and they're telling themselves that he's probably just sleeping, he's totally exhausted, I'm sure he's fine. And then they hear their doorbell ring, and they're immediately so relieved because they're thinking, Bryce is here. He's finally arrived, thank goodness. They run to the door, they open it up, and it's not Bryce, it's a police officer. And the officer asks them, do you own a 2003 Toyota Highlander car? And so Mike and Karen's hearts sank, and they say, yes, our son Bryce drives that car. The officer told them that the car had been located a few hours earlier at the bottom of a 25-foot cliff near Castaic Lake. Castaic Lake is about halfway between Button Willow and Laguna Niguel. They told the parents that there was no sign of a driver. Bryce was not there. They did find 2 small drops of blood inside the vehicle, but beyond that, there was no indication that Bryce had sustained life-threatening injuries from this crash. They said the back window of the vehicle had been broken from the inside, indicating that Bryce had escaped the wreck by punching out that window. His laptop and phone were still in the vehicle, and his wallet and duffel bag were outside the vehicle on the road and looked like they had been rummaged through before they were left there. After an examination of the damage to the car, the final tire tracks that led down to where it had been found, and traffic cameras in the area, it was concluded that Bryce had actually intentionally driven off this cliff, and he had actually hit the accelerator right before he went over the edge. After Mike and Karen headed out to the crash scene and had a chance to talk to some of the investigators that had been looking for Bryce, they informed the parents that most likely what they were looking at with this crash was a failed suicide attempt. But Mike and Karen, they just couldn't buy that. That was not like their son. And just 2 weeks earlier, when they dropped him off, he was happy, he was excited to be at school, he was talking about the future. He was not someone that was suicidal. And so what situation could he have possibly gotten himself into in just those 2 weeks that was so bad it would lead to something like this? It made investigators and the parents wonder, was Bryce hiding something? What did he mean when he said he had a lot to talk about? Did that have something to do with this thing he was hiding? A huge search was launched in and around the area where the car had been found, with hundreds of people on horseback, on ATV, on foot. There were helicopters in the air. They put divers in the lake. They looked everywhere for days and days and days, but nothing was found of Bryce. On the 9th day of the search, they brought a bloodhound out to see if it could pick up Bryce's scent, and sure enough, it did, right at the crash site. And the dog followed the scent all the way down to the lake. It walked around the lake to this bridge. It was actually a dam that went across the lake. It followed his scent right across the bridge to the other side, and then it kept on following it up this small access road until it reached a truck stop, and then his scent just stopped. And so police and the parents and everyone involved in this investigation was really surprised at this discovery. And so police got another bloodhound, a separate bloodhound. They brought it out to see if it could do the same thing, to prove that this really was his scent trail. And sure enough, the bloodhound picked up his scent. It went down to the lake, it went around to the bridge, went over, went to the truck stop, and then it just stopped. But after the scent trail was discovered, there was no other leads for anyone to follow. And so after 3 weeks of looking everywhere for Bryce, the search was called off. Some say Bryce was suicidal. That's why he drove off the cliff. That was a suicide attempt. And despite the bloodhounds picking up his scent, Bryce was most likely in the lake somewhere. Others disagree and say Bryce is still alive, that after this crash, he gets out of the car and he walks down to the lake, he walks around to that bridge, he goes up to the truck stop, and then he hitches a ride with someone and vanishes, and now he's living off the grid somewhere. And still others believe Bryce's drug and alcohol use caused a psychotic break, and that was what was causing all this strange behavior, and that was what led him to drive off the cliff. And perhaps when he landed, he sustained a vicious head wound that caused him to forget who he was, and so now he's just kind of wandering around somewhere, not knowing who he is or knowing that he's a missing person. As for his parents, they say he would never do this on purpose. He would never cause this much pain to the people that love him, and so he must have been a victim of foul play. But regardless of what you believe happened to Bryce, something happened to him, and it's probably connected to whatever it was he said he needed to talk to his mom about. That thing that he couldn't discuss on the phone that potentially he was trying to drive home to talk to his mom and dad in person about. But unless we find Bryce and he's still alive, it's unlikely we'll ever know what it was. Since August 30th, 2013, when Bryce went missing, no one has heard from him and no one has seen him. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen Podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please ask the 5-star review button to go for a walk with you in northeastern Australia and push them into a gimpy plant. Also, please subscribe to the MrBallen Podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, Google, and anywhere else you find your podcasts. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories I have posted on my YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username is @Mr.